This should be our last video over the Constitution, and we're going to wrap it up here. And this video will be about when the Constitutional Convention ends and when the fight for ratification happens, and then the eventual addition of the Bill of Rights in 1791. So the convention ends, we know, in July of 1787, and the delegates to this convention had agreed to various compromises, such as the Great Compromise, the Three-Fifths Compromise, and resolved several points of contention. The convention then turned to the process of writing this final document. So we have our rough draft, and now we're going to turn this into a final paper, a final document. That month, work is going to continue we're going to continue working on the document and putting it into a written form. In August, the convention selects a committee of style and arrangement to kind of polish up the language. Governor Morris leads this committee, and many believe that he primarily developed the document the style and wrote the preamble as well. On September 17th, 1787, the Constitution was complete. The committee completed its work and submitted the Constitution to the entire Constitutional Convention for them to sign it. Several delegates are going to refuse to sign the finished document. Some of those delegates are Elbridge Gerry, Edmund Randolph, and George Mason, and they object to the lack of the Bill of Rights that the Constitution doesn't have. 39 delegates do sign, however, and it's enough to send it to the states for ratification. And little do they know, but this is going to be up for a pretty big fight. We have a quote here. I'm going to pose a couple of questions to you that I'd like for you to answer in your notes, and we're going to look at those in class on Monday. I'll read the quote to you, and this is Benjamin Franklin, on the finished Constitution. There are several parts of this Constitution which I do not at present approve, but I am not sure I shall never approve them. I doubt, too, whether any other convention we can obtain may be able to make a better Constitution. It therefore astonishes me to find this system approaching so near to perfection as it does, and I think it will astonish our enemies. So my first question is, how does Franklin indicate the convention's success in reaching a set of compromises that could be accepted by various groups and interests? And who does Franklin refer to in the phrase, I think it will astonish our enemies? Why might he say this? Okay, think about those questions and be ready to answer those from your notes in class. The ratification procedure. So once the convention has completed its work on writing the Constitution, it's going to send the document to the states for ratification. And Article 7 of the Constitution addresses this process and required the Constitution be ratified through special conventions held in the states. To avoid the log jams that frequently occurred over proposed amendments to the Articles, the framers mandated that only 9 of the 13 states needed to ratify the Constitution for it to become law. So we didn't need 13 states to ratify it. We only needed 9 of the 13 states. Two groups are quickly going to form here. And from this, you kind of get our first political parties, which we get to talk about in our next topic. The supporters of the Constitution are going to be called Federalists. And those who oppose the ratification of the Constitution, a lot of them, because it doesn't contain a Bill of Rights guaranteeing people their freedoms, those opponents are going to be called anti-federalists. So the Federalists, and some examples of Federalists, those who wanted the Constitution ratified: Alexander Hamilton, famous today in the Broadway musical, and James Madison, going to be our fourth president, and also the author of the Constitution. Those in favor of ratification are called Federalists because their support for the federal government. So many of these Federalist leaders represented the country's elite and advocated a government by the rich and the well-born and what many called the virtuous democracy. Unlike the anti-Federalists whose support tended to come from the interior of the country, Federalists counted as strongholds the larger cities, the coastal areas, and some major Federalist leaders, Hamilton and Madison. Some anti-Federalists. One of the most staunch anti-Federalists is going to be Patrick Henry. He refuses to attend this Philadelphia convention because he says he smells a rat. In other words, like he thinks they're up to something. Some are automatically suspicious of the new Constitution, Patrick Henry being one of these. They fear that it's going to create this strong central government with no guarantee for these civil liberties, and they want this Constitution to include a Bill of Rights. Um, while the Federalists include some wealthy and well born, most of the Anti Federalists live in rural areas and were common farmers. And so it makes sense as to why they would oppose the ratification of something that they feel is a government just for the elitists. Many Anti Federalists worry about the makeup of the legislative branch, including the size of the legislative districts and the new House of Representatives. In addition, many Anti Federalists also fear that the elite are going to dominate Congress, those who have money. Others felt that the Constitution's preamble, we the people, invited a strong central government uncontrolled by the states. The best known of the Federalists is going to be Patrick Henry. He was a patriot, former governor of Virginia. Some other well-known Federalists are going to be George Clinton and Mercy Otis Warren. So we're going to set up for a fight between these Federalists and these Anti-Federalists in order to ratify this Constitution. The framers avoided the deadlock that plagued a lot of the Articles of Confederation by only requiring 9 of the 13 states to ratify the Constitution. However, even with this kind of sort of majority, ratification is far from certain. Several states, most notably Virginia, New York, and Massachusetts, hold strong majorities of Anti-Federalists in their state conventions. Neither Rhode Island nor North Carolina will hold ratification conventions in their state. In fact, Rhode Island hadn't even sent delegates to the Philadelphia Convention. The Federalists are going to devise a strategy in order to get this Constitution ratified, and they're going to target states that would likely ratify it quickly, either unanimously or nearly unanimously. Remember, unanimously means that everybody votes one way or the other. And by December of 1787, Delaware becomes the first state to ratify it, and they do this unanimously. So everybody votes to ratify the Constitution. Soon, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Georgia will also approve it. Anti-Federalists have significant influence in Massachusetts Convention, with the opposition to the Constitution heaviest in the western part of the state. And if you'll remember, that's where Shays' Rebellion had originated, these farmers who were unhappy with paying taxes. However, the Federalists overcome this by promising that the first session of the new Congress will consider adding amendments to protect civil liberties, i.e., a Bill of Rights. So after a lot of campaigning on the part of the Federalists, those pushing for the ratification of the Constitution, Massachusetts will ratify the Constitution by a very small margin. And although Anti-Federalists in New Hampshire were very, very strong, Federalists are going to manage to postpone the state convention for 4 months, and they're going to talk to the delegates in order to get them to support ratification. So New Hampshire ratifies the Constitution June 21st, 1788, becoming the 9th and crucial state in order to get the Constitution as law in the United States. However, Federalists are still going to want to gain ratification of the 2 largest states that haven't ratified the Constitution yet, Virginia and New York. And in their view, only by gaining ratification in these states will the Constitution gain legitimacy. The Federalists, those who wanted to ratify the Constitution, are going to continue talking to people and making sure that they understand why we should ratify this Constitution. 3 of the leading Federalists, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay, are going to write a series of essays supporting ratification. Collectively, these essays are called the Federalist Papers. They're going to write under various pseudonyms. Most common, they're going to sign the name of Publius, not signing their own name to these documents. Later, we'll figure out who the actual authors of the documents were. Several leading newspapers are going to publish these essays. Later, the essays will be released in a book entitled The Federalist. Scholars and legal experts are going to later use these essays to kind of interpret what these framers of the Constitution actually meant. And it's debatable whether or not the Federalists really changed public opinion regarding ratification, but the authors who write for this New York audience and publish these essays are going to sway the opinion of the people, and specifically the delegates of New York. So by the time that New York's ratification convention happens, enough states have already ratified the Constitution to make it the law of the land. So getting the ratification in the state of New York isn't going to be important in order to make the Constitution law, but they're going to want the people of New York to ratify the Constitution because it's one of the largest states in the Union. Some historians actually believe that these actions by Hamilton, Madison, and Jay were one of the most influential things in the states of New York and Virginia in getting them to ratify the Constitution. What you see here is an excerpt from Federalist number 10. We're going to kind of skim over this right now. We're going to look back over it in class, but this is an excerpt from Federalist number 10, more from Federalist number 10, and from Federalist number 84. Collectively, there's 120 of these essays written by the three leading Federalists. While Hamilton, Madison, and Jay write in support of the ratification of the Constitution, others are going to write very extensively in opposition to it. Letters from a Federal Farmer, which were probably written by Richard Henry Lee, if you remember him from the Revolutionary War, Emma Acton Smith, Mercy Otis Warren's observations on a new Constitution, and George Mason's objections to this Constitution of government, were intended to sway public opinion in the opposite direction in order to hope that they wouldn't ratify the Constitution. This is an excerpt from Observations on a New Constitution. This, again, written by Mercy Otis Warren, where she speculates as to several issues regarding the legality of even writing the Constitution. And in her listing of objections, she notes that there are specific concerns about the document's lack of protection of civil liberties. In other words, the lack of a Bill of Rights. Here's another excerpt. You can read it. We're going to look at it in class. Objections to this Constitution of Government, written by George Mason, a delegate to the Constitutional Convention. So Federalists are going to view the ratification struggles in Virginia and New York as crucial. If the new government is going to have any legitimacy at all, we need these two large states on board. In Virginia, the home of both Washington, who is the president of the Constitutional Convention, and Madison, who is considered the father of the Constitution, have a very strong anti-federalist movement led by Patrick Henry and George Mason. So throughout the ratification convention, the outcome seems very uncertain until the Federalists finally prevail in a very close voting by promising 20 amendments that the new legislature will consider following the ratification of the Constitution. So the delegates in the state of Virginia go ahead and ratify the Constitution with the hope of adding some Bill of Rights after the Constitution is ratified. Some opponents to the Constitution in New York cited the size of the state as a reason that the strong central government wouldn't be effective. However, Alexander Hamilton, one of the most persuasive of the Federalists, is going to use his influence to help sway the opinion, particularly with the publication of some of his essays in the Federalist Papers. Madison's Federalist number 10 is going to explain how a larger state could have a Republican form of government and also help sway some of the anti-Federalists to support this new Constitution. Virginia's recent ratification is also going to help kind of tip the balance in New York, and by 1789, New York is going to vote to ratify the Constitution. Nearly 18 more months are going to pass before North Carolina and finally Rhode Island will vote in favor of ratifying the Constitution and provide unanimous consent for the Constitution. So by 1789, we get all 13 states ratifying the Constitution. What it lacked was a Bill of Rights, and this lack of protection against these civil liberties. And again, modeling after the 1689 Bill of Rights in England, we very much wanted written down what the protections of our personal civil liberties were. This is going to cause a lot of controversy in the ratification debate in several states. And in order to ensure ratification, they have to agree that they're going to add this Bill of Rights, these series of amendments, once the Constitution is ratified and passed. James Madison, who's already known as the father of the Constitution, receives this task. He is told to write these amendments. He's going to look at hundreds of ideas and suggestions. He looks at various historical documents, such as the English Bill of Rights, the Virginia Declaration of Rights, which he had helped develop. He looks at the writings of John Locke, and he takes all those historical documents into consideration. He eventually settles on 12 amendments to be considered by Congress. We know that 10 of those will be ratified, and they will be passed, and they become our Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments of the Constitution. 2 of the amendments, one dealing with reapportionment of representatives, and the other with constraints on congressional pay raises, which we, incidentally enough, will get later, aren't going to get enough votes to pass initially. but will be added to the Constitution between then and now. However, since that congressional pay raise amendment didn't include a time limit for ratification, the states eventually ratify that in 1992. It becomes our 27th Amendment to the Constitution. So let's look at a summary of the Bill of Rights. We know that the first one secures your 5 freedoms: freedom of speech, religion, press, assembly, and petition. And that was one of the answers to our questions on the board today. One hallmark of Madison's work is that the Bill of Rights protects against these government abuses of people's fundamental rights. And they're very, very important to people living in the United States. And we know that the people are us. Number 2, right to keep and bear arms. And 2 and 3 are going to protect against oppression by the military. Again, coming out of the American Revolution, this makes a lot of sense that the Founding Fathers would find it important to write these protections into the Constitution. And the Second Amendment, frequently the subject of great political debate, ensures that a well-regulated militia by allowing citizens to keep and bear arms. The Third Amendment kind of seems outdated by our standards today, but it prevents citizens from being forced to house and quarter soldiers in your home in times of peace, as the colonists had to do during the American Revolution. Amendments 4 through 8 are going to concern legal rights, including protection against unreasonable searches and seizures, number 4, self-incrimination and double jeopardy, number 5. Amendments are also guarantee a speedy and public trial, number 6, and the right to legal counsel and the prohibition of cruel and unusual punishments, number 8. 6 and 7 deal with jury. 6 is the right to a trial by jury. 7 is the right to a trial by jury of your peers. And the final 2 amendments, 9 and 10, are going to promote government by the people, stating first that the people may have protected rights other than those in the Constitution, which doesn't attempt to exhaustively list every power that the people hold. The 10th Amendment gives to the states or to the people all rights not specifically addressed by the Constitution. We also can reference back to those implied powers, again given to Congress, the legislative branch, by the Necessary and Proper Clause, which says, hey, you have rights that aren't specifically listed in the Constitution. In my opinion, that gives the Constitution its flexibility and allows it to be interpreted in the light of the times rather than being quickly outdated. Some discussion questions I'd like you to write down in your notes, and we'll talk about these in class. Number 1, what system did the framers devise for ratifying the Constitution? How did this improve upon the Articles method? What were some characteristics of Federalists, the Anti-Federalists? What did opponents of the Constitution dislike the most? Number 3, how did the Constitution gain ratification in Virginia and New York despite major objections? Number 4, who received the task of writing a Bill of Rights? What sources did he rely on for developing a list of amendments? Number 5, what 4 categories of rights does the Bill of Rights protect? That's the end. That concludes our discussion over the Constitution. Make sure you take good notes, answer those questions. If you have any concerns or questions about it, email me. I will respond, and I'll see you guys on Monday.